EVO. Welcome back to The Devil Within. I want to start by thanking everybody who showed up to CrimeCon 2025 up in Denver. I was there. I had a great time. Our screening of episode 1 of Let the Devil In went great. It was a huge crowd. It was very humbling. Thank you everybody who showed up and for saying hi afterwards. It was nice to meet all of you. And I'm so excited that the show is finding an audience. Episode 2 is in release now on MGM Plus. I hope you've either watched it already or you're about to. We're going to be talking about it a bit in this episode of The Devil Within. And what we're covering here is, as you know, we're in re-release of season 1, The Jersey Devil, that Let the Devil In is based on. We did episode 1 last week. We're doing episode 2, Paradise Lost, this week. So, in this episode, we really get into how the town of Jefferson was really affected by the tragedy, which is why, for me, Milton's poem, Paradise Lost, really aligned well with the themes of this episode. So if you're not familiar with Paradise Lost, it's basically a retelling of Genesis 2 and 3, the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden and Satan's fall and Old Testament stuff. But Milton doesn't just retell the story. He expands it in a massive way into this 10,000 plus line epic poem. He gives this crazy cosmic backstory, and Adam and Eve and Satan, they have these really long speeches, and he gives an account of the battle between God and the devil, and Satan sitting there plotting and how he's going to get his revenge on God, and he's going to do it by corrupting God's greatest creation, which is humankind. So Satan makes his way back up into the Garden of Eden, and he tempts Eve with the apple, who then tempts Adam, because I guess there's always a woman to blame in these old stories. And thus the fall of man happens, and they're cast out of the garden, and angels with flaming swords are set as sentries to prevent them from coming back, and they're left to wander. And why? Because they ate the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge. They could have anything else in the garden they wanted, but one thing was forbidden to Adam and Eve, to the first humans: wisdom, knowledge, understanding. They weren't allowed to have, and because they gained it, they had to get out. So the idea of a beautiful, idyllic place being corrupted, obviously, the reason that I chose this poem for episode 2 was because I related the fall of Eden, right, and the fall of man to what happened in Jefferson in the winter of 1988. That happening in town could be understood as the town's loss of innocence, that nothing was really the same after that. When that kind of evil happens in this small, idyllic, really tight-knit community, it's tough to bounce back from. But the town has bounced back from it. I haven't lived there in 30 years, so you go there now and you talk to the cops on the force now, and they don't know about the Tommy Sullivan case. It's not like the town was unable to move on and to get past it, and they're still carrying these scars. There's definitely scars from this, but they're not still wounds, right? They're not still open wounds. There is scar tissue, but it's not like the town is only defined by this, which is how it seemed when I was a kid and in the first maybe 10 years after I left. So, Paradise Lost, John Milton. It's a very dense read, but one of the classics that I considered required reading for me, in my 20s. But and obviously it stayed with me to this point, and I think the parallel is accurate in in an allegorical way. So that's what I went for. So the episode opens. We hear a teaser from the mayor of Jefferson, still the mayor, Eric Wilsusan. So His Honor and I go back to my high school days. He was a handful of years older than me, but he did a lot of community outreach on behalf of the police department with the high school. So he would be there for fundraisers. He'd be like the cop at the football games, making sure no one got out of line. He would give the don't drink and drive speech on prom night to make sure that we all stayed safe. He always had a mind on the community and a mind on doing good. And he's a good man and a great dad and a great mayor, and he was a great police officer. So did we have a few differences back in the day? Sure. But I don't think he remembers. I remember, but if he doesn't remember, I'm happy for that. But he was one of the first people to say yes when I was gathering interviews for the podcast. And he's one of the few that appear in both the podcast and in the television show. So Mayor Will Susan, thank you very much. So we'll get to the crux of the mayor's interview, at least the portion used in episode 2, a little bit later on. I don't want to get ahead of myself by focusing on the teaser just yet, but so more on him later. In the 18 months leading up to the Sullivan murder-suicide, there had been a dramatic increase in incidents involving the occult and satanic worship across the state of New Jersey. In Middlesex County, 4 high school seniors weren't allowed to attend graduation with their classmates due to an investigation regarding what was alternately labeled as fascination with or worship of a demonic creature that the 4 friends claimed spoke to them and gave them commands. It should be made known that these kids were lifelong friends who grew up playing the 80s board game Dungeons & Dragons. It was never determined if they were joking or if their devotion to this creature was genuine. Tommy Sullivan also grew up playing Dungeons & Dragons. In South Jersey, there were a handful of reports concerning possible covens of Satanists deep in the Pine Barrens, out of reach of law enforcement and locals who might object to their methods of worship. It was never figured out if the cloaked figures in the woods were actual theistic Satanists, the type who firmly believed that Satan is an actual being that resides in a separate plane of existence and can be summoned into this one. Or the more casual, atheistic Satanists, who are in it mostly for the pageantry and the possibility of sex in the woods with a masked partner. Nearly all Satanists who are anonymously interviewed fall into the mostly curious and far less aggressive atheistic category. And they were nearly all between the ages of 25 and 45, college-educated, middle-class, white, law-abiding citizens. There were exactly 0 reports of any Satanists who were children of or around Tommy's age on law enforcement radar anywhere in the state of New Jersey. There was, however, growing concern statewide regarding youth consumption of what was deemed dangerous music. This battle against suggestive lyrics was championed by future Second Lady of the United States, Tipper Gore. It was Mrs. Gore, along with the wives of 3 other prominent politicians, who began the Parents Music Resource Center, the PMRC, an organization that successfully lobbied Congress for the rights of parents to have greater knowledge of the content of the music they were buying for their children. Specifically, material that was sexually explicit, contained foul language, or could introduce ideas of violence or compel someone to incite violence. Despite cries of censorship from every corner of the music industry, the PMRC was successful in that all music released after 1986 that contained lyrics that were considered inappropriate received a parental advisory sticker, clearly visible on its packaging. Another pebble in the shoe of the defenders of the status quo was the unlikely and unexplained spike in popularity of a book that was published over 15 years prior, the Satanic Bible. In 1969, an unknown writer named Anton LaVey authored a highly controversial book outlining the tenets, philosophies, and history of Satanism. Although not wildly popular at its release, it has to date been translated into 7 languages and been through over 30 printings. Suspected to be at least partly a work of plagiarism, it was nonetheless popular with certain groups: occultists, religious historians, and of course, Satanists. What we go over early in the episode, which was really kind of glossed over here, were these stories of kids Tommy's age, maybe a little bit older, in the state of New Jersey that were making the news for alleged satanic involvement in things. Kids who were caught like by their high school, like with doing weird ritualistic satanic things in the woods, and they either weren't allowed to graduate with their class or got in some other kind of trouble with the police, enough where it made the news and it made the parents kind of like, what's going on down by the shore? What's going on there, right? So it was, I remember some of those. And then I actually met one of those kids. I was a BMX bike rider in my teens, and I would go to these competitions and stuff, and you'd meet kids from different parts of the state in the surrounding areas. And my freshman year, I met a kid who was a senior in high school, and he was one of these kids that had gotten wrapped up in, he wouldn't call it a cult, but looking back on my conversations with this kid, it was a freaking cult. And there was a strange being that they worshipped that he had a weird name for it. Culturally, what keeps coming back to me is Children of the Corn with He Who Walks Behind the Rose from the book, and then became a movie. And this kid, I think his name was Jeff, that I was friends with, there was a being like that they gave a name to. It wasn't He Who Walks Behind the Rose, but it was something like powerful like that, something that they worshipped. It was very strange, because I was 14. I was like, oh yeah, okay, that sounds legit. And he got in a lot of trouble, and the school was terrified of him and his friends, and they thought that they were like keeping an eye on him, and he was under monitoring, and they thought they were planning some attack, and wasn't allowed to graduate with the class. So that stuff was obviously going on, at least not only in New Jersey, but also there was a larger fear nationwide that we touch on later in the episode with the PMRC, with these group of parents, the wives of senators, and they were more than the wives of senators. They were people in their own right, women in their own right. They deserve to be identified by who they are, and here I am, the dick. I don't know their names other than Tipper Gore. And they lobbied Congress successfully for the parental advisory sticker on lyrics on our favorite records, which I think, looking back historically, we can say that kind of blew up in their faces, because that only made those CDs or tapes with the sticker on them more desirable for kids my age. But that was one of the big federal movements, nationwide movements, to protect the youth of America from corruption. And one of the boxes that needed to be checked for the sticker to get on the CD was satanic material, right? That could possibly affect a kid listening to it. So I did a deeper dive into the PMRC in some episodes last summer, I think. So you can go through the back catalog of The Devil Within, and you can find those episodes. This is the mayor of Jefferson Township, Eric Wilsusen.
Being the mayor wasn't exactly like a lifelong dream. It probably wasn't really on my radar. I had worked in the police department for 31 years. I love my community. My wife and I are very active in the community. We're involved in many different aspects. So I have a genuine love for my community. I was about 25, 26 years old. I was working with a good friend of mine, Bart McConley. He was actually the first officer on the scene. And I remember I think I was over in the Lake Apacon section at the time, and that happened in our White Rock section in the Oak Ridge side of town. So I wasn't the first responding officer. I had later come on scene to help with the search, but we'll talk about that. But I remember Bart McConley being the first officer on scene, and I remember him telling me later on, when he got there, and it was the father who found his wife murdered in the basement. And I mean, it was a pretty horrific scene, and something obviously I'd never dealt with. I mean, you're a brand new police officer, you're out of the academy. Bart, my friend Bart Conley, he came on just before I did, so he maybe had less than 2 years on the job. He actually went down, saw the body, and went outside and threw up.
And so the Satanic Panic reached a fever pitch. Schools were cautioned to be on the lookout for any suspicious activity. Reading materials were closely monitored. Music was censored to the point that anything that was even remotely controversial was confiscated and destroyed. I was a freshman in high school that year, and the differences between the first half of the year before Christmas break and the second half of the year was extreme. However, the influence of the Sullivan case was most strongly felt in two main areas. The first was law enforcement, because there was now a threat to the public safety erupting from a new and mysterious wellspring.
we actually had to go through a training after this to learn more about Satanism. And I remember his funeral, he was getting buried. They actually had to post police at his gravesite because we were told, the satanic cults, that they were worried that they were going to come and try to take his body. And again, we had to get briefed on all these things because if they wanted to come and get the body, like if they actually got to the gravesite and you interfered, they would kill you. You know, this has happened, I guess, in other places where they come to try to take the body. And because they believe that, you know, the soul of the devil lives within Tommy and they want to recover that. So yeah, it was pretty intense at that time. Yeah, that these cults may come back and try to take his body. This is like, you know, a victory for the devil.
So yeah, Will Susan bringing the heat, right? So that was one of the big things that surprised me the most when I was making the podcast, was what was kept not only from the kids but from the public at large. And that statement that he just made was one of the big ones, that the police went through these trainings on how to potentially deal with a satanic cult returning to steal Tommy's body from the grave. Okay, and that if the cops tried to stop him, that they would try to kill the cops. And they had perimeters lined up around the cemetery. That blew my mind. Like I had no idea. And to his credit, Will Susan is consistent with his stories over 4 years, because it's 4 years between the podcast and the TV show. And his story never changed. He never wavered. He never was like, oh, did I say that? What? No. So this is what was going on in town. There was a legitimate fear that Tommy, A, was involved in a satanic cult, and B, that they wanted his body. As Jefferson Township was trying to pick up the pieces in the aftermath of the events of January 8th, the town was briefly and suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. Major news outlets across the country carried the story, as well as dozens of newspapers and magazines, culminating with the investigative journalist and media personality Geraldo Rivera coming to town to do a story on the Sullivan case and to raise awareness, to sound an alarm of sorts, about the rising threat of violence due to the moral corruption of the youth of America.
The Investigative News Group presents the Geraldo Rivera Special. Devil Worship, Exposing Satan's Underground.
It's teenagers who are most likely to fall under the spell of this jumble of dark, violent emotions called Satanism, and in some cases, to be driven into committing terrible deeds. How could this happen here, to a nice boy from a good Catholic school and a fine middle-class family? Father Labar, you investigate these cases for the Catholic Church. Is it the Church's position that demonic possession is possible?
It certainly is. There have been many cases down through the centuries, many in our own decade, for example, of where the devil has actually possessed people and caused them to do many strange things.
So you believe it's possible?
I believe not only is it possible, it is a reality.
If it happened in Nowhere, New Jersey, it could happen in your town, too. A town hall meeting was held to address questions from a deeply concerned community. The mayor, the county prosecutor, the chief of police, and lead investigator were made available to offer what they could to calm shaky nerves and provide some answers.
At our high school, we had to have 2 sessions that hold 600 people. It was an overflow crowd the first night, just to talk about, the whole incident and, what had happened. We brought in people who were experts in Satanism to talk about it. The area priests were involved. Basically overcrowded, we had to have a second night.
At one point, an exasperated dad stood up and demanded to know how a kid like Tommy could even get exposed to something like satanic worship.
The Catholic Church is really, they believe in the good and evil and God and the devil, and churches all over the area were having open to talk about this.
The answer was a difficult pill for the gathered to swallow. All right, so who watched Exploring Satan's Underground when you were a teenager? Whose parents made you watch it? Geraldo, man. Geraldo was the TV investigative journalist of the 80s and into the 90s. And he's still great. I still see his stuff. It comes up when he goes viral for something crazy, or when he gets into an argument with someone on live TV on Fox or whatever. he's been a voice of news for America for 40 years now, and so for Geraldo Rivera to take notice of our small town, that really put us on the map, and not in a good way, and in a way that we weren't really ready for as a community, to be in the spotlight like that. But when you see a news van and cameras and stuff set up on Tommy's front yard or in front of the police station, and Detective Hart is giving Geraldo Rivera a tour of the Sullivan home, and they're asking for comments from 13-year-old kids, that was a strange time to be in Jefferson, and it didn't allow us as a community to move on as quickly as we wanted to. So this was one of the ideas, one of the themes, one of the things I learned, and other than what was kept from the community about how dangerous the police were told these satanic cults were, other than that, this was the second biggest kind of what the hell moment that I had in this whole thing. Was that, so there were these two big town hall meetings. I remember them. I remember my mom going to them. My brother and I didn't go. With kids weren't really invited. But I never knew what was discussed there. It was never like parents didn't come home and say, okay, here's what happened. And no, parents were sent home with like instructions on and checklists to see, are your kids doing this? Then you might be fucked. So be careful, right? That's how it was. Those meetings weren't meant to spark discussion at home. The discussion all happened in the meetings, and the church leaders and the community leaders were grilled by members of the Jefferson public at large, and one of the things, looking back on it now, there's such a delicious irony in it all that would not have really landed with me as a teenager, but as an adult it does. And that's when these parents, these religious parents, these Catholic parents, these devotees of Catholicism that are regular attendees of church and believers, that they actually earnestly asked the question, where did Tommy hear about Satanism? How on earth could a good Catholic boy have learned all of these satanic things? What could have put that idea in his head? They were honestly asking that question. And when the answers came, well, where do you think he learned it? He learned about it in church, because it's been talked about since he was a child, right? That's what awaits you if you sin. That's how powerful Satan is, okay? That if you sin, or if people so they go to hell, and Satan and the original like rebellious teen, right? That defied God and tried to fight him in his own house, right? And lost and gets cast out and is down there all pissed off and like just wanting to get revenge, and I'm going to get you through the people that you love and through the kids and through whatever, right? So the parents were like, wait, what? Oh yeah, I guess you're right. That is where we learn about this stuff. So thinking about it, it must have been a very rude awakening for these parents that thought that not only they would be safe, but that their kids would be safe, wrapped in the embrace of the church and what the church had to teach. They had this blind spot where, what if there's a kid like Tommy who no one realizes is searching for some release valve, right? Who feels really pressured and who feels like he has no agency over his own life, and is just susceptible enough to a new idea of rebellion that could seem really attractive to him, that he would get those ideas from church. Tommy Sullivan was your typical American Irish Catholic teenager in New Jersey, which meant he was exposed to Catholicism on a daily basis. His week consisted of Catholic school, taught by priests and nuns Monday through Friday, where, in addition to math, science, and history, he was taught the Stations of the Cross, the Passion, Revelations, eternal damnation, archangels, and importantly, the Antichrist, that original defiant youth cast out of heaven, banished from paradise for daring to disobey his superior. Then there was, of course, church on Sunday at St. Thomas's, where Tommy served as an altar boy under the tutelage of Father Fitzpatrick, where he was again assaulted with images and stories of powerful evil forces engaged in a constant battle with the better angels of the Christian Bible. So, every day, every single day, brought demands, expectations, and restrictions on the soul of an impressionable young man who, for whatever reason, finally chose not to fear the Antichrist and his ruinous influence, but to embrace it. Indeed, he chose to identify with the defiant nature of the demons of hell and be counted among their number.
Like, wow, is the devil really at work here? Again, going back to what I said earlier about, how brutal he murdered his mother. How do you murder your mother? Bad enough you hit her over the head with an object, but then just to bludgeon her to death, and then to take his own life like he did. It was just a very brutal scene all around, and you have to say to yourself, what possesses somebody to do that? And like I said, in the Catholic Church, they believe the devil really took him over.
In the silence that befell the crowd in the wake of the mayor's troubling answer, one can imagine the confusion that must have hung there like a phantom, a deep and terrifying confusion that strained the limits of human reason. Were they supposed to accept the notion that the Catholic Church and its teachings, the very institution that they were brought up to believe would provide a cocoon of protection around their children as it had them, could instead be the instrument of their own destruction? That Tommy Sullivan's introduction into the world that would intrigue, consume, and ultimately destroy him was preached from the pulpit and taught in his classrooms. So it could be argued that Tommy was a powder keg of teen rebellion awaiting a spark. And what exactly was that spark to be? The answer to that question would take investigators down some dark roads, only to end up surprisingly close to home. And so, yes, this idea about Tommy being the perfect kid, right? Tommy being a scholar athlete and straight A's and an altar boy and always did what was right and always could be counted on to do the right thing. As long as he was delivering on those expectations, no one ever checked in. Hey, how you doing? You okay? Are you feeling a lot of pressure here? Like, anything you want to talk about? And it wasn't just that Tommy didn't get that. Kind of none of us Gen X kids really got that because our parents were working and because that's just how it was culturally, and it wasn't unique to Gen X. It was Gen X we might be the first parents that actually do kind of collectively reach out to their kids and say, hey, how are you doing, right? And from Gen X and prior to that, it just wasn't really something you talked about, like mental health in kids, because you're kids and just go out and play and run it out and go fight somebody or rub dirt on it or what, all of those cliches that you hear. And cliches become cliches because they're true, right? At some point, there was truth to those statements where you stay out till the lights come on and you drink water out of the garden hose like that. We did all of those things, But what about the kids that need help? Sometimes they find it, sometimes they don't. Tommy didn't find it, that is, but definitely needed it. So that exploration of Tommy and what his life must have been like is something that we delve into, obviously, in episode 2, and that we also delve into in Let the Devil In, episode 2. How much expectation was placed on this kid and on the other side of that coin, how little care was given as to how it was affecting him. And the result was obviously disastrous. Thanks for listening to The Devil Within. On part 2 of Paradise Lost, we explore, could there be another suspect other than Tommy who have committed these crimes? And then we also get into what, in my opinion, was the single greatest thing that the investigative team behind Let the Devil In was able to procure, which is Tommy's notebooks and all the drawings. And finally, probably the most important moment that changed the course of Tommy's life and the history of Jefferson Township, which is that assignment that he got in his Religions of the World class at Reverend Brown Catholic Middle School. So that's all in the next episode of The Devil Within. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a friend. Go over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, give a 5-star review, leave comments. Any little engagement with the algorithm helps out tremendously. And tune in to MGM Plus every Sunday for a new episode of Let the Devil In. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Branden Morgan.